Good afternoon, everyone. May I have your attention, please? Thank you. Our speaker today is Tom Blinkhorn, who worked at the World Bank for 30 years as a staff member and as manager. His career involved, among other things, work in the health and agriculture sectors in Africa, environment programs in India, including the infamous Narmada Dam project, municipal and social services, development activities in countries of the former Soviet Union. He and his family moved to Hanover a few years ago after he retired from the World Bank. Tom is a native of Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, a Canadian. Studied in the United States and worked as a journalist for several years before joining the bank. He continues to consult for the bank and is actively involved in several civic pursuits locally, including the Institute for Lifelong Education at Dartmouth. And also, if you are regular listeners of Vermont Public Radio, you may recall that he has an occasional commentary on VPR. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I want to thank not only Alex, but the Dean and the others who I had sessions with before this talk. Roger back up there in the booth, who's been so helpful, and Aubrey, who arranged the schedule. Thank you again. What I want to do today is talk to you about the World Bank, and I'm delighted that you came. You could have been watching the new president of Dartmouth instead of coming to hear the World Bank, but welcome anyway. I think some of you may have had to come, but so what? I hope I'll make it interesting for you. I'm going to give you a test right away. The question is, how many of you can identify what's on this next slide? A couple of people in the audience, like Ann and Bob Hargraves, will know what it is, but let's see if the others can know. What is that structure? Go. No, it's not Bretton Woods. It's the Mount Washington Hotel at Bretton Woods. And why am I showing that? Well, that is the birthplace of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. World War II was still raging when 450 people gathered at this hotel in 1944 to meet for 3 weeks in the middle of July to help create these international institutions. Now, why did they do that? Why Bretton Woods, you might ask? The answer is very simple. The war was raging, of course. It was very difficult to move around. The delegates, the 450, mostly men, one woman, and Ann Hargraves will appreciate this, the one woman was Mabel Newcomer, professor of economics at Vassar. So the war was raging. They had to bring the delegates into the ports of Boston and New York and then transport them by train. Special carriages were laid on. They come up through White River Junction up to Littleton, Vermont, or New Hampshire, where they were taken off the trains and taken to the hotel that we've just seen. The reason why Bretton Woods has to do with that man right there, the leader of the delegation from the United Kingdom, the famous British economist John Maynard Keynes. He's the brains behind, he and Harry Dexter White, who was an economic advisor to President Truman, they were the brains behind the creation of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And Keynes said to the Americans when this meeting was being prepared, I'm prepared to come to Washington because Europe was at war, but I can't come to Washington in July. The heat is oppressive. I'm suffering from asthma. You either put me on the sea or in the mountains or I'm not coming. And so in those days, there was a very powerful senator who was the head of the banking committee in the Senate, and he had a good relationship as a Republican with a Democrat president called Roosevelt. Amazingly, they got along very well. And Senator Tobey, Charles Tobey from New Hampshire, convinced Roosevelt that there was this marvelous hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, and that's where the meeting should be held. But there was one catch. The government had to put up $1.5 million to renovate the Mount Washington Hotel. Roosevelt said, fine, do it, let's do it. And that's how it started. The World Bank, and 3 weeks later, after intensive negotiations, including some very, very tricky maneuvers by the head of the Canadian Central Bank to keep delegates focused, hired a belly dancer from New York to keep them entertained at night. There are other stories I can tell you about later, but in any event, they signed a declaration, and it was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We can talk about the International Monetary Fund in a minute. I'll tell you the differences. That's the official name of the organization. It's now called the World Bank, but that's the official name. Now, why did they call it Reconstruction and Development? Well, the main purpose in those days was to help rebuild Europe and Japan after the war. And the first assistance program of the World Bank went to France. Germany got assistance from the World Bank, Japan, other countries did. In those days, a lot of the money was for reconstruction, but it was slow and moving, and the Marshall Plan took over most of the reconstruction work in Western Europe. So the bank was sort of struggling for a long time to find its way, and it was not until 1949 the World Bank made its first loan for what we now know as development, and that was for a power project in Chile. Now, what has happened in those years is that the bank hired mainly engineers, mainly from the United States and from Britain, and the engineers contributed to the construction of roads and bridges, and the bullet train in Japan was financed by the World Bank. Qantas airline in Australia was financed by the World Bank. Other airlines, and all kinds of what we call infrastructure. So from the beginning, let's say the 50s, until later on, most of the lending was for this purpose. Some of it was very successful, others not so successful. Here's a photograph. Do you recognize that person? That's me. Me in 1989. And now what's going on there? This is from the front page of the Times of India. And the headline, which you can't see, is World Bank Official Garoud. That's an old ancient Indian English name meaning to surround. These people are protesters. The leading leader is this lady right here, Mehta Patkar, who mobilized opposition to a large infrastructure project called the Narmada Dam on the Narmada River in western India. I was the person responsible for helping to implement that project. It was a fabulous project, in my view. Provided irrigation, provided power for areas of western India that did not have power. This is a part of the world where they had to truck in water during the dry season at tremendous expense. And this project to provide the infrastructure, a dam, we felt in the World Bank, was a realization of a dream of decades. The British had talked about it when India was a colonial period. The Narmada is a sacred river in India, third largest river. The water flowed freely to the sea. The idea is if you trap that water, build a dam, you can do amazing things for the people of Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat. But we forgot one thing. We knew about it, but we didn't do our due diligence. We'll get to this in a minute. And what the due diligence had to do when you build a dam, you create a reservoir. And the reservoir was stretching miles up the Narmada, wiping out large sections of tribal territories where 100,000 tribal people lived. And that's why these people got agitated. This is at a time, this is 1989, when you did not have the internet, you didn't have the kinds of communications that we did today, but she was so effective that she mobilized the non-governmental organizations working in the environment, Oxfam in the United Kingdom, in Norway, all of the Scandinavian NGOs interested in human rights and environment, the National Resources Development Council in Washington, on and on and on. And they created so much pressure against the World Bank, against the government of India, that the government of India said to the World Bank, would you please leave this project? We will do it on our own. And we backed off for reasons that I can explain later. It was a failure, but we learned a lot, and it was a watershed in the history of the evolution of the World Bank because it led to a broad change in environmental regulations. A new department was started, a new legal authorities, a special inspection panel was created, independent, reporting only to the World Bank president and board, not to the staff or managers. Many, many different changes occurred because not enough attention was paid to the implications of that large infrastructure project, which now is going to play into what I'm going to talk to you about later on how development as a process has changed over the years and how it has changed the World Bank and why it's going to lead to some very, very interesting challenges for Mr. Yong Kim. After infrastructure, we started becoming more interested in realizing that if we're going to be a development institution, we had to do more than just build roads. There were millions of people trying to earn living in the rural areas. There were other people who had interest in educating their children. We had to take a look at that. We never lent for education until the late 1960s. The first one was in Tunisia. We had to look at the financial systems of developing countries so that they could afford to finance and pay back loans and develop a sustainable opportunities for development. We realized late that one of the big challenges was to educate women and make sure that the health and safety and education of women and children was a forefront mission of the World Bank. Governance needed attention. There was virtually no rule of law in many of these societies that was accountable. There's no transparency. There was no ways, particularly in the former Soviet Union, of trying to correct the injustices and the corruption that existed. That was absolutely essential, and we realized that we could put a lot of money into dams and roads, but unless you have a system that is able to regulate that and control it and make it financially sustainable, you will never succeed. We learned a lot of hard lessons during these years. One of the things that has happened as a result of all of this is that the bank, largely because of the pressure of non-governmental organizations, has become much more open than it was in the past. When I started at the World Bank in the 1970s, most of the analysis and most of the work that we did was confidential. We would never share it with anyone. Today, you can go and get anything you want free from the World Bank, data sets. This is an example of something that you might be interested in getting. You can get access to information and data, comparative data on gross domestic product, on education levels, on health, comparing rich countries with poor countries. Today, the bank has strategic priorities that are much more elaborate than they were when I started. Targeting the poor and the vulnerable, creating opportunities for growth, promoting global collective action, strengthening governance and managing risk and preparing for crises like climate change, like extremes in the weather that affect poor countries like Haiti and the Caribbean and the South Pacific nations, much more severely than they do for rich countries. We'll get to that later. These are the ways that let me go back and say that I mentioned that. Now let me just say something about how the bank gets its money and what it does with its bank with the money. I'll get to there's some other affiliated organizations that you need to know about, but for right now, the money from the World Bank comes from the sale of bonds and securities in the international market. World Bank bonds are AAA rated, the best in the world, and they are purchased by central banks, by governments, by corporations. You can buy a World Bank bond if you wish. And that money is then turned around and lent to our borrowers. We have 187 members in the institution totally, of which about 100 are active borrowers. But some of them have incomes that are higher than others. And so, for example, countries that qualify for a World Bank loan have per capita incomes of between 1,500 a year and 6,000. If you're in that band, you can qualify for a World Bank loan, which goes out at 25 years repayment, 5 years of grace, and an interest rate that reflects the cost of the borrowing to the World Bank. The other source of money over here is something called IDA, the International Development Association, which was created in the early 1960s at the instigation, curiously enough, of a Republican senator from Oklahoma, Mike Monroney. And he pushed this entity because in those days, a lot of poor countries were taking on debt at exorbitant rates, and they were unable to repay it. And so this fund goes to the poorest of the poor, countries with per capita incomes of less than 1,600, 500 a year. And those countries are primarily in Africa, some in Central America, although interestingly enough, India still is allowed to borrow IDA money as well as World Bank money, and I'll explain why in a minute. The IDA money comes from the profits of the World Bank that are reinvested in IDA, comes from contributions of countries, rich countries around the world. It also comes from countries that used to borrow from the bank but have grown and have graduated to the point that they are now donors. 25 countries used to borrow from the bank, have graduated because their per capita incomes have increased and they've grown, like Chile, like the Philippines, and they contribute. Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania used to borrow from the bank. They are now donors to the bank. They've graduated. These are the institutions of the World Bank. The two on the left that I've just described are the ones that lend the money and get it back and have programs and technical advice. The three on the right are they are mainly technical assistance agencies. That one right there is, well, there's an exception to this. These three in blue only work in the private sector. These two right here work solely with governments or with government guarantees. This one right here, the International Finance Corporation, was set up in 1956 solely to work in the private sector and to work with investors or equity firms, banks, to promote private investment in countries and develop the private sector in the developing countries. This one right here is called the Multilateral Institution for MIGA, Multilateral Insurance Guarantee Agency. It's an entity that helps to insure the private sector investments. And this one right here is the International Consortium for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. It works wherever there's a dispute between investors and the government to help resolve that. roughly around the total World Bank lending is about $43 billion. And you will see that there are blips depending on what is happening in the world. During the crisis of financial crisis of 08 and 09, the bank, along with other international institutions, lent a lot more than it normally does. It was up to about 70 to 80. These are the sectors to which the money is lent. The first one is transportation. I believe I'm correct in that. The second largest sector for the World Bank lending looks like health and other social services. No, public administration, law, and justice is number one. Transportation is number two. Health and education, health and social services, 16. And energy and mining, 14%. That gives you an idea of where the assistance goes in which sectors. Now I'll show you the major borrowers of the World Bank. Top borrower of the bank money, that's the money that goes out at 25 years, 5 years grace, is India, followed by Mexico, Brazil, and these countries. You will always obviously have a question about why do countries like China and India and Brazil continue to borrow from the World Bank when they're growing so fast. I'll tell you about that in a minute. IDA, the top borrowers, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Vietnam, and so forth. They're the top 10. You will note that the biggest IDA borrowers remain in Africa, right in here. Now, this tells you something about the governance of the organization. At the time of Bretton Woods, the United States was the largest shareholder in the bank. And you have to remember that the bank is very, very different from the United Nations in the sense that it is controlled by the rich countries. It is not a one country, one vote system as the United Nations is. The formula goes like this. Whatever your capital subscription is, that earns you the concomitant amount of voting power. So in 1944, the United States contributed 60% of the capital of the bank and got 60% of the vote in the board. That meant that anything that was done in the bank had to be approved by the United States. Today, that has changed dramatically. As you can see, the United States is, well, let's see that. The United States remains number one at 16%, a far cry from 60. Japan is next, second largest. Germany, France, United Kingdom. China is in here. Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the world, 52%. Here are the shareholders, 188 countries. The board of directors, the governors of the World Bank representing each of the countries, 188, are usually the secretaries of Treasury. So up until yesterday, the governor of the United States for the World Bank was Mr. Tim Geithner, Dartmouth grad. And before that, another Dartmouth grad, Hank Paulson. They were the governors of the World Bank for the United States. Dartmouth has other connections, of course. A lot of the faculty consult for the bank, including Tim Geithner's sister, who lives here in Hanover. She works at the World Bank. There are other connections with Hanover and the World Bank I'll tell you about in a minute. And then the board of directors are on site. They have offices in the bank, and they are designated by the countries. So the big countries like the United States have a single member of the board of directors. The smaller countries have constellations of groups. So, for example, Canada is the representative for Ireland, Jamaica, and 2 other Caribbean countries because they're small shareholders and so forth. Now, the next one will tell you who are we. Incidentally, this slideshow was sent up to me from my friends in the Bank Speakers Bureau last week. It's the same one that was done for Al Gore when he did Inconvenient Truth. 10,000 employees, 7,000 of whom are in Washington. 120 country offices around the world, 3,000 of employees there. 170 nationalities. 140 languages. Keep these numbers in mind because I'm going to tell you about one of Jim Kim's challenges in a minute. Not the only game in town, obviously. Used to be, not anymore. Look at all these organizations. Grameen Bank, Bangladesh. Well, USA has been around for a long time. The International Monetary Fund is the sister institution right across 19th Street in Washington from the bank. Oxfam Care, Save the Children. This one right here is big and very influential. And you all know the Gates Foundation. We also have rock stars. They become very interested in development and what happens to the poor in the world. And this is a rock, I should not say rock star. This is a famous Colombian singer, songwriter. Shakira is her name. And she has set up her own nonprofit organization that helps the education of poor children in Colombia. She's also very, I think she's on the board of Bill Clinton's institution. She's highly committed to poor. I'm going to show you next a couple of other rock stars, one rock star and one wannabe rock star. Here's the rock star, Bono. There's the wannabe right there. Jim Kim, you see he's not wearing his green tie, and he's got his sleeves rolled up. So he seems to be at home at the World Bank. This was done last November. And it was a meeting in the atrium of the main building of the World Bank. And the place was packed. And Jim Kim was talking about his commitment and passion for helping alleviate the poor and what his strategic priorities are going to be in the course of his 5-year term. It was a very exciting session. Although progress has been made over the last 10, 15 years in terms of reduction of poverty globally, in terms of health and education for the poor. Health, for example, one of the projects that I was associated when I went to the bank in the 1970s was a program in West Africa called onchocerciasis, river blindness, it's named. It was rampant in 7 countries of the Volta Basin in West Africa. And up until then, the World Bank had no interest or action in the field of health. But the president of the bank, Robert McNamara, on a visit to what was then known as Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, he met a French entomologist who had been studying this disease for 20 years. And McNamara and his wife had him for lunch, and they learned a great deal about this disease and how it was impacting the whole Volta River Basin and rendering people in their 30s and 40s blind, because the disease is spread by a female black fly who breeds in fast-moving waters and spreads a vector that attacks over time with repeated infestation the optic nerve and renders people blind. And they can't work. And so you will see in villages all through this area in those days, little children leading their parents or adults along paths to get water and food with a stick because they couldn't walk. And so McNamara was devastated, and he said, "What the hell is this?" He said, "Why isn't the international community doing something about this?" And René Labert, the French entomologist, said, "Because of the bureaucracy at the World Health Organization in Geneva. They know all about it, and nothing is being done." So McNamara immediately decided that the World Bank was going to get into the health sector for the first time. You can imagine the heat that he got from the World Health Organization and from the board of the bank. The board of the bank did not want anything to do with health. McNamara was a very persuasive man on this and many other issues, and he drove it through the board. And my role in those days was to help a team of people put together a persuasive statement about why this disease was an impediment to development, and because it was an impediment to development, we had an obligation to do something about it. That was the message. So I was given money to hire a film team from New York. We went throughout the whole river, the basin, and did a 28-minute film about this disease and its impact. 8 voiceovers, particularly in Arabic, so that we could sell it to Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the other rich countries. And we raised $150 million for the first phase of the eradication. The bank has made many mistakes in Africa. This is the single most successful thing it has ever done. And if you go into the atrium of the bank today, you will see a large statue of a blind man being led by a little boy to commemorate that event. There's lots to be done. There's still great poverty in the world. The price of food is excessive in these countries. People are starving, there's malnutrition, and these are some of the priorities that we are going to face and that Jim Kim is going to face in the future. Health is a major problem. It's one of the major problems for the bank in HIV eradication as well as malaria. We're working very closely with Bill Gates and the others on this program. Jobs are very, very important and will continue to be. Lack of work. Shelter. Education. Security. Most important, water. One of the big, big issues in addition to climate change in this century, our lack of potable water. But most important, and here's where development has been redefined over the years, certainly since I started working at the bank. And it's not simply moving money around, and it's not simply providing technical advice and thinking you know best. The things that we've learned over the years are that we had an arrogance at the World Bank that got us into a lot of trouble. We have to learn humility. We have to learn that unless we engage the people that we are trying to help in a truly sophisticated way, not just with economists and scientists, but with social scientists and anthropologists, unless we do that, we're going to fail. Because dealing with different cultures and different ethnic groups, different patterns of living, is extremely important in this work. We learned this the hard way. I certainly learned it through the Narmada Project. The people that we're trying to help really need to be respected and have a voice in what is happening to them, even the poorest of the poor. But how to do that? These are the priority goals that were set by nations of the world and the multilateral institutions in 2002 at Monterrey, in Mexico, and they have to do with the eradication of poverty, universal primary education, empowerment for women and promotion of gender equality, reduction of child mortality, improving maternal health, combating HIV and malaria and other diseases, ensuring environmental sustainability, and developing in stronger global partnerships. These are the marching orders for the international institutions, and they have specific targets to meet by 2015. Some progress is being made. We're on the goal to wiping out extreme poverty, less than $1.25 a day, and it's moving in the right direction. But there are other parts of the world that are not doing so well. Large parts of Africa, for example. This chart shows you some of the challenges that remain on the Millennium Goals, and you'll see that there's a long way to go. One of the biggest problems is the population of the planet. In 1960, there were 6 billion people. It's going to be 9 billion people, not too long from now. That has enormous implications. This is another big issue. If you look at the latest issue of The Economist, you'll see a fascinating article there based on a study that was done in the World Bank and also with McKinsey and the Boston Consulting Group on the emergence of the middle class in China and India particularly, but also in the BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, Mexico. These countries are growing faster than the old developed world in the Western Europe and the United States. They are developing middle classes. And what that means, it has great opportunity for traditional kinds of capitalism, consumer capitalism. McDonald's, for example, in India, has tailored its menu to appeal to the Indian taste, similarly in China. Pizza Hut does the same thing. They know that this market is coming and it's going to be big, and they've got to get in there and they've got to find out ways to tap into this market. That's happening on that side of the equation. But there's another side, as in most human affairs. The other side is that there's going to be more traffic, more need for, as we all know in this country, it's going to have an impact on the environment, on pollution, on safe water, and all of these issues, education, jobs, resources, and social safety nets for elderly people. So, before we get into what you can do, let me say a word about the new president of the World Bank, Mr. Kim. I think that he comes to the job with a lot of attributes and experience that no previous president of the bank had. First of all, he has worked in developing countries. No previous World Bank president ever worked in developing countries. Even though his experience is limited to Haiti, Central America, Rwanda, and to the narrow health nutrition sector, which is growing, incidentally. When I was working at the bank, health nutrition took about maybe 3% of the total portfolio of assistance and money and all the rest. Today it's 12%, and I think it's going to grow under Kim. But he had that experience, and that is very important. Second of all, he is a passionate, quick learner, and I think that he will rise to the occasion. So far, he certainly has conveyed that spirit of commitment at the World Bank. His big challenges are going to come in dealing with this new world that we have, with the issues of climate change, about which he may know as much as you do or I do, how to deal with countries that are generating the middle class, how to mobilize assistance in a world that has so many actors, how to deal with a bureaucracy of 10,000 people, highly educated, greatly motivated, who work in silos like Dartmouth College, but it's multiplied 10, 20 times. That's a major challenge, to try to manage that crowd. And I don't think he has that experience. I think that he will gain it in time because he's a smart man and he's committed and he's going to have people helping him. But virtually every president that's come in, certainly during my period, has had the need to try to reorganize the bank, to try to generate and get commitment to a vision that the president has. It's still very much a hierarchical institution in that sense. But in today's world, where we have automatic information, where amazing things happen. When I was working in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal in the 70s, if I wanted to call my office in Washington, if I were in Accra, Ghana, I had to go through London, and I had to wait a long time to get into my boss. If I were working in Senegal, I had to go through Paris in order to get to Washington. That day is long gone. And even better, take a country like Kenya. Cell phones, ubiquitous, 60% penetration in Kenya. If you go to a middle of Kenya in the remotest area, a farmer can pick up his cell phone and find out what, not only what the price of a commodity is in Nairobi, but much more. That individual can track what is going on in any other part of the country through the cell phone to find out what is that agricultural project doing down there in the Masai Mara that the World Bank financed, and how is it working compared to the one right here where the guy is stealing the money? And how are we going to control that? That guy can get information back to the office of the bank in Nairobi and into Washington faster than we could ever. And they'll take action. It's an empowerment device. The technology is empowering people in ways that we never imagined. It also creates some problems. So these are the challenges that we face in development. There are ways that you can get involved. If you go on to the worldbank.org, you will see links and drop-down devices. You will see a Twitter account called What does it take? Check it out. You'll be very surprised at the dialogue that's going on right now with Kim, with the managing directors of the bank, and with people all over the world on some of these issues that we've been talking about. These are examples of some of the links on the World Bank page. It's, you can become a partner with the bank, but as this boy says, the future is not some place we are going to, but one we create. Thank you very much. Ula, we have one question, one time for one of your questions. Who wants to start? You take care of that.
You speak of the level of poverty, and I suppose you assume that we all know what it means, but I don't. What's the definition of that, and is it uniform in all the countries that you work in?
Well, we have sort of mathematical standards that are inadequate, but generally any individual that earns less than $2 a day is said to be living in poverty. But there are metrics that have been developed that are more sophisticated than that simplistic statement. That's an easy way of sort of visualizing it. Countries with less than $1,500 per capita a year, another way. But it has to do more with the lack of good, safe water, shelter, with ability to have a health treatment. All of the things, the rudimentary things that we take for granted and that either do not exist or exist in different ways and are hard to get. For example, I worked in the countries of the former Soviet Union, including Belarus, where my friend Marina comes from. And even though there were health systems under Soviet Union, and there were great scientists, trained people, trained scientists, doctors and whatnot, the economic system did not work. If a woman was having a baby and she had trouble, the Gosplan in Moscow, as you well know, set a price for that delivery. Had no relation to market demand, supply and demand. That woman had to find a way to pay that doctor under the table. So if you go to a town like Lviv in western Ukraine and talk to the guy who runs the power station and say, how do you get your money? And he takes me to a warehouse and he shows me inside the warehouse sewing machines, small bicycles. It's a barter system. And you know, under a barter system, it may work, but it may not work. And you know, there was rampant tuberculosis. So even though Ukraine, on the scale of things, is more advanced on the per capita numbers than, say, Chad or Burkina Faso, well, maybe it isn't. Maybe it isn't. I mean, I dealt with a situation in Ukraine where they had rampant tuberculosis. And then the Ministry of Health, who was a communist dictator, said, no, we don't want any help, but we got it covered. And finally, we found the mayor of Odessa in the south, in the Black Sea, who said, we really need help. So we got doctors from the from the World Health Organization and others to come in and say that if you go into the prisons of your town and work with the prisoners in there, where most of the disease is coming from, and use simple DOTS, delivery on time, is that what it is, Michael? In other words, take your medications on time regularly, you have a chance maybe of combating this. Very simple, very cost effective. And we demonstrated in the city of Odessa that it could be done, and finally they woke up in Kiev and started doing it. But what I'm trying to say is that measures of poverty cannot be done mathematically. They have to be looked at in the totality of what a society is and what it's trying to do. And there you can make judgments about what, who's making progress or not. The Gates Foundation is doing great things. And they are more nimble in the World Bank. They are doing some fascinating things in microfinance and in health. I'm bringing one of their senior officials to Dartmouth in July for the ILEAD summer lecture series, and she's going to talk about the Gates' program in microfinance and use of cell technology all over the world. Amazing things. We have a woman that works for her from Keene, New Hampshire, Joyce Lehman, who's been working in Afghanistan. She'll also be on the program. So I invite you to come. Mike.
You mentioned the role of a couple of outfits like Pizza Hut and McDonald's.
Yeah.
They have been widely identified as skillful marketers of
Yes.
high fat, high salt,
Yes.
fructose-laden food.
That's
What are
right.
they doing in China?
They're certainly not doing anything on that front that I'm aware of. What they're trying to do is make a penetration into the market to sell and just get their name registered. I don't know that they are dealing with these kinds of issues that we are taking into account and are of concern in this society. But it is what I was trying to point out with that information about the middle class is that the unintended consequences of growth and the good life, as we have defined it in a capitalist society, it may not work anymore. We have to look at different models. This gentleman.
Why is China still getting money?
Okay, China is still getting money because they, and this is, I'll go beyond that answer to this question, because they value the international experience that the World Bank presents. The bank has the largest knowledge group of intelligent, experienced people anywhere in the world on planning of cities, on transportation, on health, on ports, you name it, it's there. And what the Chinese want from us is basically knowledge exchange. They will pay for us to help them think. Now, Brazil did it that way, or Nigeria, and we can bring it to them fast, and right there in symposiums or online or whatnot. So that's the main thing that they're interested in. But they're also interested in borrowing money long-term for alleviation of poverty in the West. They still have large numbers of very, very poor people while they're growing in the South and elsewhere, and they welcome that. The other side of this is very interesting, and it goes to Jim Kim. They are saying they are contributors to the bank now. As you see from the chart, they have their own seat on the board, mainly because they're powerful and they contribute money to the bank. They want to be part of the international community, and they prefer the international community run in the bank than, let's say, NATO or something. But the quid pro quo is they want power. They want, at some point in the future, to have a president of the World Bank. And one of the issues when Zelig, the previous president, left was India and China said, wait a minute. This arrangement where the American is always the president of the bank and a non-American is head of the IMF, we got to stop that nonsense. That goes back to 1944 when you guys were had all the money and were in control. That's not happening anymore. But they couldn't get together. The Indians and the Chinese could not get together on a candidate. Plus, the United States still holds 16%. It's the major shareholder. So Obama came up with basically an idea, thanks to Tim Geithner. Hey, we got this a Korean American over here who has developing country experience. He's now president of Dartmouth. He's a good person. Put him in there, and it won't be another white male American who has no developing country experience. And that's how they sold it. But I tell you right now that it's not going to be like that forever, because in the next go around, the Indians or the Chinese are going to come together, and there's going to be, I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe, a non-American head of the World Bank. Yes?
One thing I find interesting is that the largest sector for the investment is public administration and social justice.
Yes.
I think it's very hard to value the achievement compared with transportation, health, and nutrition. So how do you guys regulate the super?
Yeah, good question. The reason basically goes back to a point that I was trying to make earlier, which is that we can, and don't get me wrong here, because I believe personally that the education of women and children and their health is the most important thing that we can do. The fact that the numbers do not show that we lend as much money there as we do for rule of law and justice is a bit misleading. But let's take your point and discuss it for a minute. It goes back to this, that unless you have in a society a trustworthy system that people can rely on for adjudication of disputes, for rule of law, for police and law enforcement people that are well paid and do what they're supposed to do and are not taking money under the table, for all of the things like that, a cadaster that shows you where who owns that property over there, and how can we be ensured that that is our property. This was a big issue in the Baltics, for example, after they became members of the World Bank, because a lot of those people had their properties taken away from them by the Russians, including in Latvia, Jewish people who migrated to Israel. But when they became members of the World Bank, they came back and said, wait a minute, that's my grandmother's house. How come you got that house? And so we had to help the Latvians and the Estonians develop with lawyers and people mainly from Sweden, we borrowed the Swedish cadastre system to set in place a legislative mechanism, administrative mechanism that people could trust and that would help them resolve these disputes so that you had property. And it's very, very important because it has to do with taxation. It has to do with security for loans. It has so many implications, this rule of law and this administration. And that is why it's so important in our portfolio. And? Cadastre is a way, if you go to the list, if you go down to the Hanover Town Hall, you will see a large list of properties in Hanover. And if you look on Cutting Corner, and it'll show Ann and Bob Hargraves and what you're there, what your taxes and everything. That is basically a cadastre. It's a map of the town with the properties delineated and showed who owns what.
It's the French word for the registry of deeds, basically.
That's it. That's it. Good. Thank you. Yes?
You mentioned that you were going to explain more about Dartmouth's relationship to the World Bank.
Okay, well, what I was saying about that is basically has to do with personalities. It has to do with Paulson and Geithner mainly, and the fact that a lot of professors like Eric Edmonds in economics, Nancy Marion in economics, Bob Breckenridge, who used to be in the environment department, all of them are consultants for the World Bank. And Geithner's sister, who lives over here on Maple Street, she is an employee of the World Bank. So it was that thing. That's all it was. It's not as if Dartmouth is an intellectual engine of the World Bank or anything like that. I mean, Harvard is much more influential. Yes. I have a Harvard connection.
How do you deal with corruption in places like India?
Oh, good question. Very, very good question. We do it. There are many different aspects of this. Okay, the World Bank makes. Where are you from? Bombay. Okay. World Bank makes a loan to Mumbai as we did, for sanitation improvement. $400 million. And what that involves is basically machinery and engineers and planners and pipes and all the rest. So there's procurement involved. And what we do is we have international rules for procurement. I'm just giving you one example of corruption coming in. There are many others. And in order to counter that, because we know there's big money here, and there's a lot of people who want a cut of it. So the way we do it is that we say, okay, here are the rules for the procurement of those pipes that are going to clean up Mumbai. And it's open to international competitive bidding. It's not just Indian suppliers that can do it, and they're quite capable of doing it. This is an international institution, this is an international loan, and you have got to agree to that. Indians don't like that. A lot of countries don't like, well, but we're a poor country, we need to create jobs for our people. How come you're letting the Americans do that? Because we want to have it open, number one. Number two, so all the bids come in. And there's a price on it. So we set up an independent group of people that have nothing to do with the project, lawyers, whoever, 4 or 5 people, and they evaluate. We're staying away from it at this point. They evaluate it, and they evaluate the bids. Not just on price, but on capacity to be able to do this kind of work. What's your track record? What's your management style? Who are your people? Who are you hiring? What are you paying them? All these kinds of questions. And that goes into an evaluation. And they're told in advance, this is the way we're going to weigh your, and you get 10 points for this, you get 20 points for that, and price is not high on the list. So once that comes together, the panel says, okay, we've looked at this evaluation, and we're recommending that this bid go to that company. And this goes then to the North Block in Delhi, or the South Block, and then to Washington. And we have to agree, okay, Joe Blow gets the contract. And sometimes they disagree. It's one way to control corruption, but it'll never be totally controlled. And we know that because we've had many, many cases of people who have been corrupt with World Bank money in projects. And therefore, under the previous president, the bank decided to set up a brand new vice presidency for integrity. And it is headed by a former prosecutor from South Africa called Leonard McCarthy, who was head of a unit in Johannesburg called the Scorpions that Nelson Mandela set up to root out corruption in South Africa after he became head of state. Leonard McCarthy was hired to be vice president of integrity. He has hired FBI agents, CIA people from Interpol. He came to Dartmouth 2 years ago at my invitation and gave a marvelous speech at Spalding Auditorium. And his job basically is to look and report and have a secret line he's got a line out to anyone that wants to register a complaint about a World Bank project, including inside the bank. And several people have been fired inside the bank as a result of Mickey Mousing around with this. So that's another way. There are other ways and other things that have been done to try to control the corruption. It exists. It's rampant in parts of the United States and other, as we well know. So this is not, and it will always be there. But we try our best not only to correct it and check it, but to institute mechanisms within our developing countries to help them deal with it. And one of the worst offenders are customs. If you go through Eastern Europe, or when I was working there, or virtually anywhere else, the customs officials are poorly paid and they accept bribes. You can't get on an airplane in Lagos unless you bribe a customs official. And that still exists. So what we've been doing is to try to upgrade the customs people, take people from, let's say, Bucharest or Romania and take them up to the Scandinavian countries have great systems, and educate them about how it works there. And then we have to increase their salaries, because if you don't increase their salaries and educate them and train them, they'll still want bribes. And they may still want bribes, but at least we have a track record of diminishing that impulse.
Do you account for bribes?
If we find it, and if we can, we have evidence, then we'll publicize it. I mean, I work with a guy from a Danish accountant who was a consultant to a project I was involved in Romania. I thought he did a great job. He was helping me check the financial records of an entity with which I was associated. I always make sure that he had terms of reference from me, and I always made sure that he reported properly, and whatever he reported was vetted by someone in the bank. Perfect. Turned out that the guy had an operation going in Tanzania, and he was not only bribing, but getting a large amount of money from an inside person in the World Bank that was working with him. He's now in jail in Copenhagen. That's totally transparent.
If there are any more questions, I invite you to speak with Tom, who will be here for a while.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
I recall that you are meeting with another faculty member after this, and
Mike,
then after that with me, and we'll go have a beer upstairs. If you want.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Tom. My name is Deepu.
Yeah,
I'm a
how are you?
first year MBA student at TAC.
Uh-huh.
And,
Yeah.
Very interested in
Good.
World Bank, because
Uh-huh.
World Bank is on top of my list after
Good,
TAC.
good. What is your year? What year in?
I'm in Talk School.
Yeah,
of
well,
Business.
yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. First year, second year?
First year.
Uh-huh.
First year. And actually, I've been to World Bank in December, and meet one of the Talk alumni. She got the chances to show me around inside the new headquarters.
Good.
It's gorgeous, amazing.
Yeah.
And
well, Matt Slaughter does a lot of work down. I mean, he goes to the bank for it. Thanks a lot, Roger.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Take it, Michael.
Yeah.
and also, it's